My name is Jananne Al-Ani, and I'm an artist working with photography and moving image, and I'm interested in looking at the relationship between the body and contested landscapes.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. It's a delight to see you all here for the next in our series of Unexpected View talks. I'm so thrilled that we're here with Jananne Al-Ani, the fantastic filmmaker and photographer, to talk about this wonderful painting in our collection, Egbert van der Poel's A View of Delft After the Explosion of 1654. Jananne and I will be talking about some of the themes in her own work that connect to this painting. As you know, this is a series of talks where we invite an artist into the collection to choose a work and use that painting as a way of exploring some of the themes in their own work to allow us to see and look at the painting in a very different way, but also to explore how different artists are working today. So before I go further in the introduction and introduce Jananne more formally, we must thank Hiscox as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner for their support of these talks. So Jananne is a London-based artist, a researcher and lecturer whose work spanning the past 2 decades focuses on the traces of conflict and the disappearances of the body within highly charged and contested landscapes. Her work teaches us what these images do in shaping the way that we look back at history and how this history is communicated through these images across society. Jananne has held many solo exhibitions, both here in the UK and internationally. I'm only going to name a few, but most recently at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne, the Beirut Art Centre, the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, Imperial War Museum and Hayward Gallery here in London, at the Delft Explosion in Amman, and alongside her participation in numerous group exhibitions, Jananne's work has been presented at the 9th Asia Pacific Triennial in 2018, the Sharjah Biennial in 2013, and the Venice Biennial in 2011, so many prestigious exhibitions. Her work can also be found in collections here in the UK at the V&A, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, amongst many others as well. As a teacher, Jananne is reader in photography and moving image and senior lecturer in photography at the University of Arts London. I'm pleased that we're speaking in front of van der Poel's painting today, which is actually the only work by him that we have in the collection. And it's interesting that it's a work that has captured the imagination of many people. So it's wonderful that we can pick up on that today. So not only Jananne, but also writers such as Brian Dillon and more recently Laura Cumming have also written about this fantastic work. So I'm quite excited that we're going to be exploring this painting and all of the intricacies and all of the themes and the nuances that it has, showing this moment, particular historic moment of an explosion that happened in Delft in the year of 1654. So before we go on to talk about the painting itself or talk about some of your own work, when we approached you to do this talk, Jananne, how did we come to choose this painting in particular?
Well, I knew straight away that this is a painting I wanted to talk about because although I have a long relationship with the National Gallery and the collection, this is a painting that I only learnt about recently through Brian Dillon's book, The Great Explosion. And I came across his book when I was doing research for a film that I made in 2016 called Black Powder Peninsula. And I was looking for locations in the British landscape to make a film where I've been making films from the air for a number of years already, and I wanted to find locations in Britain that I could film from the air that would make the British landscape look kind of alien and different, and perhaps even more kind of desert-like or kind of Middle Eastern. So I was looking at places like Lincolnshire, thinking about the Wash, or Orford Ness, or Dungeness, places where there was a lot of sand, tidal areas. But I also was very interested in sites where there had been military industries or where the army had been based or the navy, so anything to do with Britain's military and industrial past as well. And I sort of gradually got closer and closer to resolving where I was going to film by looking at Kent, which was surprising because it's so close to London, but actually the area between the Medway estuary and the Thames estuary, which is the Hoo Peninsula, became the kind of site that I decided to focus on. And then I discovered Brian Dillon's book because I started looking particularly at that area, and he had published this book the year before, or very close to, during the same time that I was doing the research. And I was just so excited because he was specifically talking about this accident that had happened in a gunpowder factory during the First World War. And he talks about this painting because this is also an earlier occurrence of an accident in a gunpowder store in Delft, right in the middle of the city. And as soon as I read about it, I sort of came looking for it in the gallery because I didn't know it before. And I found it, I'm not sure if it was in this room. I just remember finding it in this very small, dark gallery. And, you know, and thinking when I saw it how strange it was, because it kind of it's a history painting, but it's a history painting of a sort of single catastrophic event. Yeah. That has a kind of reportage quality to it. So I was kind of interested in that relationship between painting and photography, which of course is something that people have written about a lot in relation to the Dutch Golden Age and Dutch painting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that actually you pick up on some of the kind of strangeness about this painting. So it shows this moment of this catastrophic explosion in Delft. A building which was storing about 90,000 pounds worth of gunpowder underground, exploded all at once. So it caused this devastating impact on the city, a huge explosion that destroyed much of the surrounding area and had an impact even miles away. You know, the sound, the effects of this explosion was really huge. You know, we know from recent years the devastation that huge explosions can have on communities on different parts of the world. In 1654, this must have been incredibly, it's had devastating, but had incredible impact on the way that you think about this, quaint town, city of Delft. You can visit there today and see how beautiful it is. So it must have had such an impact on not only that area of the Netherlands, but also surrounding as well. And so it's interesting. So just to say about Van der Poel, he was an artist working in Delft at the time and living in Delft. So he, and I think he was born in the city as well. So to be able to, live through a catastrophic event like this, his studio was in an area not far from the explosion site. People he knew were killed by the explosion, including Carol Fabricius, whose painting we have underneath as well. So it had a huge impact on the way that he perceived and related to Delft. It's interesting that he decided to then depict it, and he depicts it in a very particular way.
Well, it turns out that he depicts this event over and over again, which is also very interesting because that happens very rarely with painting, but of course it's something that happens often with photography. Yeah. So again, thinking about the relationship between the idea of the photographic image or the photographic record of a historic event or a catastrophic event like this, and the idea of painting it. So the date on the painting, you'll be able to see it when you come up later, but he dates the painting with the date of the explosion, which of course can't be the date that the painting was made, and every version of the painting that he then makes after that. So he's supposed to have made 20 different versions of this event, sometimes showing the actual explosion, sometimes showing the aftermath. And in each of those paintings, he dates it with the 12th of October, 1654. So it becomes a kind of obsession for him. But one of the things that's very interesting, of course, yes, is that there are lots of artists living in Delft, and some survive the explosion and some don't.
And it's interesting to think about why he came to paint this event. So I think this explosion became a world event, really. Well, definitely a European event. So many members of royalty or ambassadors, governments from different parts of Europe actually came to Delft to show their support, sent letters of condolences and things like that. So in a way, I think Van der Poel was really providing a function, in a sense, of documenting and circulating images of this event, showing the catastrophe and the aftermath of what this explosion caused.
That's true, but he's not the only artist that
No.
represents it. And one of the things that I was interested in with Brian Dillon's book is the way that he is exploring in his book how artists represent an event like this, like an explosion, something that happens in a split second and completely transforms the place where it happens. So he's interested in looking at the way in which writers, so looking in literature and trying to find ways in which writers have described explosions or these kind of catastrophic accidents, and also painters, which is one of the reasons why he's looking at this painting, and there are a number of other paintings he looks at. So for me, I was very interested in this idea of the explosion being a little bit like the taking of a photograph, the moment of an explosion being this fraction of a second where everything is transformed, and then thinking in photography about the photographic process, the shutter being open for a fraction of a second and capturing this image, and then thinking about how painters are struggling to represent this moment before the invention of photography, and then thinking about all the stories around the practice of Dutch painters and their relationship to looking through the lens, basically. So thinking about, in Laura Cummings' book, which is also about the same event, she's written this beautiful memoir that's sort of built around Fabricius's story, actually. So Van der Poel just plays a small part in her book. But thinking about how artists represent something like this, which is something that's kind of unimaginable, and also something that when you're in it, you can't actually see it. It's something that happens to you, but it's not something that you can visualize. So how you visualize something like that?
I think we both noted that there's so much sky within this painting. The actual city takes up the lower quarter of the painting. I wonder if you could expand on the way that you think about the different perspectives that you use within your work.
Yeah, and also just go back to the Brian Dillon book. His book is really an account of his walks in this landscape. So he's taking these very kind of lonely, melancholy walks through this very bleak landscape. So the landscape of the Hoop Peninsula, it's very, very flat and marshy and really bleak. And it's a site of, this is where convict ships were kept and where quarantine ships were kept in these estuaries. It's the bleak landscape of Great Expectations. So that it's a really melancholy landscape. And one of the things that he talks about is the flatness of it, and that's what's interesting to me. So he's in it as a walker. He's walking in this landscape, so he has a particular view of it, which is very expansive. So it's really flat, and there's lots and lots of sky. And for me, taking this vertical perspective totally transforms that landscape into something else. So the landscape then becomes much more like a drawing. And it's only when you're kind of up above that landscape, then you start to see all these kind of traces of all this other historic activity in the landscape. So the site of the Great Explosion that he writes about is a gunpowder factory very close to Faversham, where this terrible accident happens. And there's very little to see of that site now unless you're up in the air. And then you can sort of see the footprints of some of the buildings. You can't quite see the site of the explosion, but it's there. I kind of managed to locate it exactly. On the west side of the Hoop Peninsula, there's an abandoned gunpowder factory, which actually is on some of the images that you can see there. So, you can see there's this very kind of geometric pattern in the landscape, these very formal structures. So there's something very interesting about the abstraction of the shapes. And then you see the kind of residues of, oil refineries, power stations, all sorts of dead and sort of dying industry. But one of the things that I wanted to just talk about was sound. So, the idea that this explosion, it's so huge, and the sound of it traveled for many miles. So it's it's something like 70 miles. So with the Kent explosion, people in the north of France could hear it. People in London say that their windows rattled. Windows closer to the explosion were all blown out. So, this idea of sound is very important in my work, and also something that I've kind of, so where I've made these aerial films, I've also been very careful about how I compose the sound that goes along with them.
So the new film that you've made,
Sounds of
Sounds
War.
of War.
Yeah.
I remember watching this film and seeing these aerial shots of different airfields.
Yeah.
Um,
In East Anglia again.
In East Anglia, so
Another.
in a particular location, but seeing the sort of historic image and the sort of image of that landscape now sort of morphing from one to the other, and over the top, which really resonant was this extraordinary soundscape of explosions,
Sort of listening to
aircraft, but
Yeah.
also bird song as well. And we see birds, the few parts of nature that you can see in this scene.
So the trees are completely stripped. I mean, when you come and look at the painting more closely, so the trees have been completely stripped of their leaves, but the birds kind of survive. Something about sound and birdsong, actually. So one of the things I also wanted to talk about was the fact that Dylan focuses on accidents. These are accidents that happen with gunpowder. And what I'm very interested in is why the gunpowder is there in the first place.
Yeah.
He doesn't really touch on that, although he does talk about the Great War, and of course, that the whole reason why the accident happens is because production for the First World War is in overdrive, and so people get sloppy, and something catches on fire, and then there's this huge catastrophic explosion. But I wanted to think about contemporary warfare, which is kind of where my work starts, thinking about the 91 Gulf War and the 2003 Gulf War, and thinking about aerial warfare in general, going right back to the beginnings of aerial warfare during the First World War. And I just wanted to read a small extract from a diary, thinking about birds and what sound does to birds. A diary from an Iraqi artist who lived in Baghdad during the 91 Gulf War and published afterwards her diaries. And the book's called Baghdad Diaries. But I just wanted to read this tiny clip about what she says about what happens to the birds during this intense bombardment. The birds have taken the worst beating of all. They have sensitive souls which cannot take all this hideous noise and vibration from the bombing. All the caged lovebirds have died from the shock of the blasts, while the birds in the wild fly upside down and do crazy somersaults. Hundreds, if not thousands, have died in the orchard. Lonely survivors fly about in a distracted fashion, which is really amazing, because it kind of reminded me a little bit of what's going on in this painting, where this is sort of the immediate aftermath of the blast. People are shocked, and you hear people's accounts. So people's accounts of the Beirut blast recently, that often people were knocked over by the blast before the explosion. The explosion actually reaches them. There's a kind of air. There's a sort of the air sort of pushes out violently.
Yeah.
So you can see people here being picked up off the ground. You're not quite sure whether they've been affected by whether they're dead or whether they've just been knocked over. There's bits of clothing. There's a boot here that you're not really sure whether it's got someone's foot in it or if it's just somebody's boot has come off. It's kind of this moment of aftermath.
Yeah. Or this moment of confusion after an aftermath, right? And I think there's something interesting about particularly the way that Van der Poel has chosen to show this moment of, perhaps, lots of bodies, either those that are strewn across the landscape or busy trying to, do things with, make themselves useful, tidy, find more survivors, all sorts of things. So it's a really interesting way of trying to make this landscape or this moment something that's active or something that's of concern to a number of people. One thing that I think is interesting in the way that you've just touched on the Gulf War, but particularly thinking about our perceptions of conflicts in other places. And often, I think in your work, you help us review the way that we might perceive some of these conflicts that have happened in a much distant, in a very distant place. The way that the media might come to represent some of these conflicts. I'm thinking about the films that you've made, which actually bring a bit more presence or a bit more of an understanding to the people or the industries that might happen within a certain place. So Shadow Sites, for example, is a work where you have looked at the aerial, again using aerial photography or aerial views of a certain landscape.
Yeah, I mean, those were the first aerial films that I made, the Shadow Sites films, and they were really thinking about this relationship between the camera and the aeroplane that starts in the First World War, and the way in which taking a camera up over the trenches of the First World War immediately meant that the kind of horrors that were on the ground were disappeared, you know, and the whole kind of landscape of the war became this abstract. You know, the photographs of that conflict from the air look like beautiful etchings. You know, you see the kind of trench systems, you see the little pock marks from the shelling. If it's in the snow, you know, they kind of becomes almost sublime abstractions of this thing, which is a kind of landscape of horror. So I wanted to try and think about that and think about how that way of looking at landscape had influenced the way in which other areas in the world have been recorded or represented. So thinking about the Middle East landscape and the desert and the kind of European fantasy of the desert being this landscape that's completely emptied out, that nothing happens in it. It's like a blank canvas. Yeah. And then trying to use the technology of aerial warfare to reinstill that landscape with a presence. So to show archaeological remains, to show sites that have been there, you know, for millennia. This kind of building up of the layers of history in a landscape. Yeah. So, you know, thinking about how the ground itself can almost become like a photographic plate. So, you know, the analogy between the archaeological site that you see from the air and a photographic plate, you know, that you can only see the image if the lighting is in a particular, you know, if the sun is low in the sky, you might see an archaeological site that you wouldn't see if the sun was high in the sky. So again, you know, with the explosion, thinking about the way in which all of these kind of events leave a mark on the landscape, and how we might read those marks in the landscape, which is why I was interested in this very flat part of southeast of England, so either Kent or East Anglia, for the site of my films, because they're like a piece of paper or a photographic plate, and yet all of this evidence of all this activity is there, but you only see it when you're above it.
And then it's interesting to think about how those stories sort of resonate within those sort of settings. I think Brian Dillon talks about this a lot in his book. And how these kind of narratives then are circulated in certain ways. I want to touch on your film timelines, because in a sense, I think when we were reflecting on this painting in our previous conversations, we were thinking about what the function of this painting might be, you know, not only in documenting an event, but who might it be for. You know, it could be for these visiting dignitaries who are visiting Delft and want to have a sort of document of the disaster or something, or it could be about communicating actually how horrific this event was. Van der Poel left Delft in the same year of the explosion, so he would have made several of these paintings or drawings of this event, and then returned to the subject numerous times later when he moved to Rotterdam. I think there's several reasons why he probably would have returned to it. One, in order to kind of make paintings for that market that were interested in having a sort of document of that event. But also, I mean, we learnt that he also lost his 2-year-old daughter in the explosion as well. So perhaps for him, it was also a way of returning to that moment or processing what that explosion meant. It could. There's also something interesting about making a painting for a market, in a sense, or having this painting on the wall in your own home. What that speaks to about, you know, your relationship to other events in some way. Timelines was an interesting project because you produced this panoramic film that sort of fills an entire room. that projects in a sort of very panoramic way in the sort of fashion of a Victorian diorama. But it focuses on a very small object, I guess, in comparison. This tray that is in the collection of the V&A.
Yeah. Which actually was probably commissioned. So this is a brass tray that's only about this big that was made in Iraq in the early 1920s and purports to represent Armistice Day at the end of the First World War. And I was shown the tray by a curator at the V&A who'd written about it and who was showing me the tray because it had these two biplanes on it. And he knew that I'd been making work about, looking at early aerial photography and aerial archaeology, and when I saw it, it's a very busy painting, and there are some details there's an image of it in the handouts, but it has crowd scenes with Arab men and women and English military personnel. There are guns and cannon, and it's really, really kind of busy and kind of almost cartoonish, a little bit like the Van der Poel. When you look closely at the characters in this painting, the way that they're painted, which is very interesting, in comparison to some of the other paintings here, which were really, really refined. There's a kind of crudeness to the figures in these paintings. They're almost cartoonish. But what's actually being shown is somebody who's being led to the gallows and is being executed by hanging. It's showing these aeroplanes kind of crashing into civilians. It's showing people crossing, looking like they're kind of escaping from something. So when I first saw it, I was like, well, this is obviously not just about armistice. This is about the rebellion, the British occupation that followed, and then the rebellion that came in response to that. And the way in which the British used air power to attack civilian populations to quell the uprising, because by the end of the First World War, the British forces were all totally exhausted, but they had this new technology of flight, and so they started experimenting with it, and they worked out that if they could attack the villages from where the rebels came, then they could, it's effectively a form of kind of collective punishment, that this would actually dampen down the rebellion, which is exactly what ended up happening. And the occupation continued, and Iraq was then, made into a modern nation state, undermanned, blah, blah, blah. So the kind of history of the Middle East, in a way, is kind of formed in this moment. And I suppose that's why, for me, I'm very interested in focusing on that period, because it's also a period in British imperial history that's not very well known. It sort of comes after the end of the war and before the Second World War, which becomes the moment where this technology has become so sophisticated, that this idea of the destruction of whole cities becomes a possibility from the air. And one of the things I think is really interesting about having all of this sky in this painting, and in a lot of the paintings in this room, this is where danger comes from in the future. This is where you look in fear from the future, in the future. So it's really, that's why I really love these, 3 or 4 birds that we see, flying above this disaster area in the painting.
What I find interesting about timelines and your engagement with this tray, so it's a utilitarian object, it's an everyday object which stands in almost as a piece of propaganda for this, a representation of this moment in history, is that you also treat it as a landscape, and you work along the flatness of this object. So there's moments in the film, in this diorama, where suddenly the camera gets close into the crevices of the metalwork of this tray, and using, I imagine, CGI to recreate almost like an aerial view that goes through.
So we sort of fly in over the tray, and the tray becomes the landscape, out of which it's kind of born. But I think the whole for me, my interest in the technologies of photography and film, in a way, interesting kind of in relation to what Laura Cummings writes about in her book, in relation to Fabricius and this idea of looking through the lens, because for her, she's sort of trying to say, don't be seduced by the technology or the kind of visual trickery of these viewing boxes, but look at what's going on in the painting. That's what she's kind of saying, and I agree with her. In a way, the technology is only a way of getting our attention or getting the audience's attention in order to engage with what's happening in the image. And so that's, I would agree with her in that sense, that although it's very interesting that looking through the lens affects the way in which artists make paintings before photography, when photography does arrive, it also comes with its own complexities. It's not a straightforward way of representing the real world in the way that maybe some of these paintings are trying to do. It's much more than that. It's more complex than that.
And I think that's why I've also found the way that you present some of your films interesting in that sense, you know, of taking some of these very these traditional ways or these old-fashioned ways of kind of presenting. So the diorama, for example, is, you know, a form of showing something as a spectacle. You know, you enter into a room and you have this grand image of a landscape or a setting or around you. You know, it's a form of entertainment. Yet there's a way of, I think, bringing actually a point of view across through that method of presenting a work, right? Presenting
which of course is interesting, because a diorama is all about the illusion of reality, which is what photography is, less so than painting. But it's interesting because one of the things I was thinking about looking again in this gallery is this idea of, so one of the things I didn't really understand until I read Laura Cummings' book was just how prolific Dutch painters were, and how common it was for people to have paintings in their homes in a way that didn't really happen anywhere else, that Dutch painters were very prolific, and most people had paintings in their homes, and they were paintings of ordinary scenes. They weren't, you know, they weren't portraits of the great and the good, or battle scenes or whatever it was, you know. And you sort of see that represented in this room. And I kind of think it's very interesting to think about the relationship between that and photography becoming, you know, a medium for everybody, the way that anybody can be a photographer or anyone can take a photograph now. This idea of having images around us all the time of everything that's going on, including very ordinary, kind of almost mundane scenes.
Well, in a sense, you could argue if that of this Fabritius, you know, writers and art historians fixate on this warping of this landscape and the perspective of how Fabritius has composed this image, yet it actually shows quite an ordinary scene. The way that this young man is sort of looking out in some sort of contemplation, which is something that Laura Cummings picks up on in her.
Which is interesting, of course, because in fact, the only painting in this room that shows anything that's kind of spectacular or is a kind of historic moment is this painting.
Yeah, yeah. And you've decided to talk about it today. I think maybe that's a good point to sort of wrap up. But I want to thank you, Jananne, for being for choosing Van der Poel's painting to talk about. I think there's so much in this work which is quite extraordinary, partly because it's a sort of almost like an imagined documentation. You know, it draws that line between what's fiction and reality. But to explore it and talk about some of your works has been really fantastic. So please join me in thanking Jananne for joining us today.